All right, we'll say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Adar Aleph, Mrs. Selma Woolf, for dedicating all the Shiurim and Drushos this month with immense gratitude for the refuos from Hashem and the merit of our refuah for all of those in need, and the zchus of our soldiers, and the merit of Hashem and the zchus of the return of our hostages. The Schwarzbaum family in memory of Rabbi Aharon Schwarzbaum, Aharon Yosef ben Meir, zechus, and the Ziv, Lavine, and Behrman families in memory of Bill Ziv, Zev Shmuel ben Yisrael, zechus, and of course we dedicate all of Maseches Bava Kama Le'ilui Nishmas Master Sergeant Eliyahu Harush Hashem Yikom Damo. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the Neshama Lavine aliyah and the families in Neshama. And of course, we also take the opportunity, the same way that we always memorialize those who we have lost, you must also take the opportunity to say Hodu Hashem Kitov Kilam Chasdo. The incredible news of the rescue, dramatic rescue of two hostages last night in Rafah. We hope that Emir Hashem Kadosh Baruch Hu should give Siyata D'Shmaya to our soldiers to be able to bring all of our hostages home, and Emir Hashem, they should all be zechus, be reunited with their families b'shalom and b'karov. Let's say with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Kuf Beis 102, and we are starting Emir Hashem. We are starting at the top of 102. I'm Rav Kahana. So let's say, so remember again, we have a lot of open items going into today's daf. In Meretz Hashem, we're hopefully going to get some good resolution. Hopefully, if we have the opportunity, a nice Rambam, a nice Shulchan Aruch, and Meretz Hashem will hopefully, if not today, tomorrow, Meretz Hashem, we'll close out everything. So remember again, we originally were in the topic of the way the Gemara phrased it was Yesh Shevach Samanim Ala Tzemer O Ein Shevach Samanim Ala Tzemer, which literally means, does dye add a quantitative or qualitative benefit to wool or not? Now remember again, the other way that Rashi phrased that was Chazusa Milsa O Lav Milsa. Does a change of appearance represent, is the change of appearance something that is halachically significant or not? Or not? Which I will say, which is interesting because essentially what the Gemara is asking is, does a change in an item that doesn't in any way enhance usage, is that considered to be a financial improvement or not? That's the fundamental question the Gemara was dealing with. We then went off into a tangent about does Shemitah apply, which types of items does Shemitah apply to, and what doesn't apply to. So the one thing the Gemara came up with is that Shemitah won't apply to wood, to eitzim. Why not? Because the Gemara had a drush which explained that in order for something to have Shemitah sanctity, what has to happen? Benefit and destruction have to occur simultaneously, or benefit and consumption have to occur simultaneously. But because when it comes to wood, benefit and destruction or consumption do not apply at the same time, right? Ultimately, again, the destruction comes immediately when it's kindled, but ultimately, again, the benefit really only comes later on when it turns into coals. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, eitzim are not subject to shvius. So that's what we're picking up with. I'm Rav Kahana. We'll say first line 102a. I'm Rav Kahana. The eitzim la'asaka tanahi. Now we'll say, now if you remember again, the Gemara then brought up, what about the case of this oily wood? So apparently oily wood, I don't know what type of wood it is, but oily wood, well, what can you do with it? You could ignite it and use it as a torch. So isn't that a case where destruction and benefit are simultaneous, and therefore halacha l'maisa there should be a din of shmita, right? There should have kedusha shvius. To which the Gemara answered, stam eitzim la'asaka. Generally, wood is used for kindling; it's not used for igniting torches. So now the Gemara says, Rav Kahana, the eitzim la'asaka tanahi. This concept that wood is normally used for kindling is in and of itself a machlokes tanaim. Look at Rashi. First of the short lines in Rashi, Tanahi, Ikalaman Damar Stam Eitzim Lasaka, Nitnu, Velo Chayla Shvius, Afilo Eitzim de Mishchan, Veikalaman de Lesle, Veitzim de Mishchan Mia Chayla. So we're going to see that this concept, Stam Eitzim Lahasaka, do we say that normally wood, trees, branches are set aside for kindling, right? Is that ultimately, again, is that a widely held belief or not? So that's a machlokes tanaim. Here we go. So the Gemara says this time we learned in the Brisa, in most imperial shvius, lo lemishra v'lo lekvosa Below the chvusas was the interesting case. You can't use the fruits of shias. We'll say mishra means for the soaking of flax. The kvusa means for laundering purposes. Now, what's the case over here? Look at Rashi. L'socha mishra. Ein shoren pishtan b'yayin shal shvius. V'chi ein mechapsin begadim dahavi schora. So we'll say this is actually quite fascinating. So apparently, one of the ways that you could soak flax is you can go ahead and put flax into wine. Into wine. Also, apparently, wine could be used for laundering. Who knew? Right? Who knew? Wine could be used for laundering. So, so now watch this. So I have Shemitah wine. That's to do with the screw top, right? That's to do with screw top wine. As well say so now I have Shemitah wine. So now you can't use Shemitah wine to soak your flax, and you can't use Shemitah wine ultimately for your laundry. Now why not? Now Rashi says because use of Shemitah wine for either of these purposes falls under the umbrella of schora. Now we'll say schora literally means what? Business. Now, Rashi over here, Pashtas doesn't literally mean business, but what he means is like this. Shemitah produce, you're allowed to use for consumption purposes. You can't use it pretty much for anything other than consumption, because anything other than consumption essentially falls under the umbrella of commercial, right? And you can't use Shemitah produce for anything that is associated with anything commercial. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, can't use Shemitah wine for the soaking of your... Now again, by the way, this is my own flax, right? This is my own laundry. Nevertheless, you cannot use Shemitah wine for these purposes. Okay? Rabbi Yossi says, Nostin pero shvius l'socha mishra, l'socha kvusa. Rabbi Yossi says, yes, you can. Yes, you can. So what's going on here? My time with the Rabbanon. What's the Rabbanon's logic? Right? Remember again. So the Rabbanon say, you cannot use Shemitah grapes or Shemitah wine. We'll call it either for laundering or for soak or for flax soaking. What's the logic? Amakra, the pasuk says liachla v'lo lemishra, liachla v'lo lekvusa, because the pasuk says explicitly by Shemitah. I will say, what can you do? What can one do with Shemitah produce? What can you do? Eat it. So Shemitah produce is fit for consumption, but it is not fit for any other kind of use. So you could use it to eat, but you can't use it for flax. You could use it to eat, but you can't use it for laundering. Rabbi Yossi says, Amar Kra, lachem, l'chol tzarcheichem. Rabbi Yossi, on the other hand, will dash in the word, lachem, the pasuk says, and most remember again, they're both quoting, this is incredible, they're both quoting from the same pasuk. V'haisa Shabbos ha'aretz lachem li'achla. Lachem la'achla. So the Rabbanan say la'achla means you can use Shemitah produce to eat, but you can't use it for laundering, and you can't use it for flax soaking. And Rabbi Yossi will say, lachem means you could use it for any of your own uses. Right? Can't use it for commercial purposes, but you could use it for any of your own uses. For example, soaking your flax and laundering your clothing. I have v'Rabbanon, nami haksiv lachem. Rabbanon, it also says lachem. What do you do with the lachem? So lachem dumya de la'achla. So also here it is. So ultimately, the Rabbanon will say that ultimately lachem has to be comparable to achla. How so? B'mishana asa ubi'uro shavin. So we'll say, listen to this. This is incredible. We'll say, once again, the Rabbanon say, what is unique about consumption? What's unique about consumption? The achla. The uniqueness is that what? Ultimately, benefit and destruction occur simultaneously, right? When you eat something, I'm benefiting and I'm destroying, so to speak, the item at the same time. So the achla, according to the Rabbanon, becomes the paradigmatic example of how you are permitted to benefit from Shemitah produce. So therefore, the Rabbanon will agree, lachem also means you could benefit from Shemitah produce even outside of just eating it. As long as what? As long as your benefit is exactly like eating. In other words, any benefit you have from Shemitah produce, the benefit and the destruction have to be simultaneous. Incredible. So the Gemara says, therefore, based on that, Yatsu Mishra Ukvusa Shana Asar Achar Biurin. So we'll say, therefore, this would come to exclude the case of what? Of using Shemitah wine for soaking your laundry or soaking your flax. Why? Because we'll say, listen to this. Ultimately, when does the destruction of the wine take place? When does the destruction of the wine take place? right? Immediately, right? Once you pour the wine into the flax, that's it, it's done, right? Once you pour it into the laundry, it's done. But the benefit only comes sometime later, right? I don't know how long it takes, however long it takes to soak flax or to go ahead and do a load of laundry with wine, right? At the end of the day, that's the amount of time that it takes to get the benefit. It's very interesting. Very interesting. 5. Rabbi Yossi nami haksiv liachla. Rabbi Yossi, ultimately, again, it also says liachla. So what does Rabbi Yossi do with that? Amar lecha hahomi baile lechedisanya. Rabbi Yossi will say ultimately again that you need it for the following brayso. Disanya liachla velo limlugma. So the Gemara says, so you can use it to eat, but not from a lugma. People say, what's malugma? So Rashi just gives a last word over here. We'll say malugma is like a medicinal ointment. A medicinal ointment, right? Something you're going to use to go ahead and smear on the body for some type of medicinal purpose. So you can't use it for malugma. So what's is interesting, right? See here, Rabbi Yossi is saying is, Shemitah produce could be used for benefit, but cannot be used for medicinal purposes. So Rabbi Yossi says like this. Rabbi Yossi will say, you could use Shemitah produce to eat, but not for medicinal purposes. Says the Gemara, maybe it means you could use it to eat, but not for laundering purposes. Kishu omer lachem hare kvusa amar. No, because once the pasuk says lachem comes to include what? Lachem comes to include laundry. So the Gemara says amar hamani makayim liachla. So what does it mean when it says liachla? Liachla velo limalugma. It means to eat it, but ultimately again not to go ahead and use it for this medicinal ointment. So the Gemara says, okay. So let me get this straight. Umara is the rabos hakvusa ulahotzias hamalugma. So we'll say some size. So now the Gemara says, I don't understand. Rabbi Yossi, you're including certain things and you're excluding other things, right? So Rabbi Yossi is saying like this, that the achla, let's go back. Remember, Rabbi Yossi says in general, lachem, right? Lachem means you could use Shemitah produce for all types of benefit, personal benefit, okay? Then the achla, Rabbi Yossi says, comes to exclude using it for like a medicinal ointment, right? But yet, you can use it for laundering and flaxing. I'm just going to make that into a verb, right? For laundering and flaxing. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. How do you know what to include and what to exclude? So how do you know ultimately, again, that lachem comes to include laundering and flaxing, but yet excludes the use of truma stuff? Of Shemitah produce for medicinal purposes. So the Gemara says, "Ma rois l'rabos hakvuso l'hotziam l'ugma." How do you know to include permission for laundering and to exclude ultimately use for medicinal ointment? Tushmar says very simple. Rabbi Yossi says, "Mar ba'aniyas hakvusa sheshava b'chaladam umotzi aniyas hamalugma she'ino shava b'chaladam." It's very interesting. Rabbi Yossi will say, "I include laundry." Why? Rabbi say, why? Everyone needs laundry. Everyone needs laundry, and I will exclude the malugba, the medicinal ointment. Why? Not everybody needs that. We'll say very interesting. So in other words, when it comes to permission to use Shemitah produce, Rabbi Yossi would rather use the lachem to include something which by definition is common to the human dynamic, i.e. laundry, and exclude something that may or may not be common to everyone, i.e. the malugma. Okay, so we'll say, so incredible. So we'll say, so this, just if we pause here for just a second, so this is our fundamental machlokas. Remember again, we'll say, how do we get here? The Gemara wanted to say that ultimately, again, stam itzim lahasaka, that ultimately, again, the concept that, actually, let's finish up first the Gemara. So, kiman azlaha desanya. So we'll say, whose opinion is reflected in the following brayso? The achla v'lo l'malugma. Right, that Shemitah produce is permitted for consumption, but not permitted ultimately again for medicinal healing. The achla v'lo l'ziluf, or we'll say you could use Shemitah produce for consumption, but not ziluf. We'll say ziluf is literally again sprinkling. Rashi says, or ziluf shemizalfin yayin bebayis V'hainami ein shave b'chol adam sheitzarach ziluf ela adam munag mudan. So we'll say essentially, ziluf means like people use wine like as like an air freshener, like potpourri, right? You want the house to smell nice, you sprinkle wine. So the Gemara says you go. Whose opinion is it that says you can use shemitah produce for consumption, but not for medicinal ointment, or liachla for consumption ultimately again, but not for ziluf sprinkling, liachla. You could use it for consumption, but not for apiktvizin. Apiktvizin is a type of concoction, Rashi says lahaki, that would cause a person to vomit. Right? The person needed to induce vomiting, you'd create this concoction. So, Kiman, whose opinion is this? Rabbi Yossi. We'll say all of this reflects the view of Rabbi Yossi. Di Rabbanon, Ikanayim Mishra Kvuza. Because we'll say, remember again, now the Rabbanon agree with all of this also. All of this also, right? The Rabbanan don't disagree. The Rabbanan just would also add on that what? You also can't use shemitah produce for laundering and flaxing. Okay, so obviously that limited list is going to be reflective of Rabbi Yossi and not the Rabbanan. I will say, by the way, just as an aside, we happen to paskin that shemitah produce cannot be used for laundering and flaxing. We happen to paskin that way. In addition, we also paskin all these other restrictions as well. You can't use it for anointment. You can't use it to induce vomiting. You can't use it to go ahead and ziluf. Ultimately, again for sprinkling. So I just want to point out the reason why this whole Gemara, why was this brought up over here? Because also remember again, let's circle back. The reason why the Gemara wanted to suggest that trees are not subject to shemitah sanctity. Eitzim, it's really wood, not trees. Eitzim, wood, is not subject to shemitah sanctity is why? Because in order to be subject to shemitah sanctity, what do you need? You need hana'asan ubi'uran shabin. That's the principle. I'll say, this is actually one of these really incredible and important like shas rules that you just keep in your back pocket. In order to be subject to shemitah sanctity, the item has to be hana'asan ubi'uran shabin. Benefit and destruction have to occur simultaneously. If they do not, then by definition, the particular item in question is not subject to shemitah sanctity. Therefore, wood, assuming that what? Rabbi said, this presupposes stam itzim lahasaka, that general wood is used for what? Kindling purposes, right? Fire purposes. And when do you get true benefit from wood when you burn it? Really when it becomes coals, right? Which means is already after, so to speak, it's been destroyed, right? As soon as you ignite it, it's effectively destroyed. So that's the destruction. But the hana only comes later. So assuming that you hold stam itzim lahasaka, so therefore itzim wood is really not going to be subject to shemitah restrictions because kedusha shvius, because halacha l'maisa, the benefit and the destruction do not occur simultaneously. The Gemara just brought that down, that this idea of hana'asan ubi'uran shavin is a machlokes tanoim. Or I should say, stam itzim la'asaka is a machlokes tanoim. That's all. So again, ultimately, that the Rabbanan are going to hold, that halacha l'maisa, you can't use peros shvius, right? You cannot use peros shvius. You can't use peros shvius in mishra, in flax water, right? In flaxing and in laundering. They will say, now what's interesting about that? The benefits and destruction don't occur at the same time. Just interesting to point out, right? In other words, that destruction of the wine occurs immediately. Ultimately, again, benefit doesn't occur until sometime later on. So we're just pointing out that this whole thing is in machlokes tanaim. So we'll say, what do we emerge with from this sugya? So number one, we emerge with the concept that this principle by Shemitah. We also emerge with the idea, just halacha l'maisa, all of these things that we mentioned are prohibited when it comes to Shemitah produce. No laundering, no flaxing, no ointments, no sprinkling. Right? Shemitah produce could be used for consumption. That's pretty much it. But any of these secondary uses are going to be prohibited. Good. So I'll say let's go back to now. Actually, just before we go right there, how do we paskin? Let's just close the circle over here. So how do we paskin halacha l'maisa with the coloring of the wall? Right. So in other words, very again, we'll say how did this whole thing start? This whole thing started ultimately again. Do we say that a change in appearance is halachically significant or not? So listen to the way the Rambam deals with this. So the Rambam Hilchos Gzela v'Aved, laws of theft Perek Gimel, Halacha, what is Halacha Yud? See, here it is. Misha hayalot semer v'samanim shruyim, uba echa v'tzava asam v'samanan, shlomi das chavero. So mishalim lo dmei ma shehifsid b'tzemer, ve'inu mechashe lo shevach samanim al gabi atzemer. So we'll say, now listen to this. Essentially, the Gemara says as follows. If I go over to Ruvain, and Ruvain has wool and dye. Wool and dye. And what do? I dye his wool. And now I give him back his dyed wool. So I'll say, now, if you're Ruvain, what's your claim? You owe me what? Wool and dye. But I don't want to dye in the wool. I want to dye separately. So the Rambam paskins in this kind of case that halacha l'maisa, we value damages in what did I deprive Ruvain of by dyeing his wool. In other words, because there is a potential loss that could come from that, or there is some type of potential damage, but ultimately the Rambam says we do not take into account any type of benefit, any type of shevach that ultimately resulted from the dyeing of the wool itself. So in other words, what we look at in this particular case is halacha l'maisa, did I cause damage to Ruvain by dyeing his wool? If I caused damage, then ultimately I'm going to have to pay the wool plus damage. Right? However, if halacha l'maisa, I didn't cause any damage, I give it back as is, and we do not take into account essentially the impact of the dye on the wool, which essentially is the Rambam teaching us about. Now again, this is the unique case where both items belong to the same person, right? Obviously, if both items belong to two different people, that's a different kind of case. But assuming that halacha l'maisa, the dye wool really went ahead and belonged to the same person, assuming that I did not cause any change in the value of the wool, essentially what do? I give back the wool and shalom Yisrael. Okay, so since the way the Rambam is saying is that halacha l'maisa chazusa lav milsa, change in appearance is not halachically significant. It appears the way the Rambam is paskening. Okay, let's go back there. Says the Gemara, Yehuda Omer Ima Shavach. So let's remember again. Let's go back to the Mishnah for just a moment. And it's all, the truth is, we're going to have to, I'm giving you the Rambam just to kind of satiate you a little bit. I know you're hungry, you're chomping at the bit for a little bit of resolution from yesterday. So that's why I didn't want to leave you in that state of existential, halachic anxiety. So I wanted to give you a little bit just to satisfy you. But l'maisa, we're not finished yet. There's still more. Because remember, the real machlokes ultimately is Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah. Right? Remember again, what was that case? That case was ultimately again, what was it? Yeah, that was the case of the Tzvala Adam Tzava Shachar Tzava Adam. So say that was the case where ultimately again I hire Ruvain to dye my wool. I hire him to dye it red, he dyes it black, or vice versa. What's the halacha? Rabbi Meir Omer no sin lo demeit samro. Rabbi Meir says in that case, what's the halacha? What do I pay Ruvain? What does Ruvain pay me? Ruvain pays me ultimately again the value of my wool. We'll say, remember again, we got a lot of stuff going on over here. What does Rabbi Meir hold? What does Rabbi Meir hold? Shinui kona. Both say, got to have these things, right? Shinui kona, which means that when you take something and you change it, what effectively happens? Right? You acquire the item. So therefore, again, when I give the wool to Ruvain and Ruvain I wanted to dye it black, he dyed it red, he effectively acquires the item. He acquires the dyed wool. So it's pretty much, he's like a thief. Now, again, he's not a thief, but halachically, he's kind of like theft. Why? Because it was essentially he acquires the item and he owes me the value of the item at the time from the time that he got it. So for halacha l'maisa, he owes the value of the wool. Shinui kona. Rabbi Yehuda says no, that's not the way it works. Rabbi Yehuda says Ruvain gives me back the wool. So now I have dyed wool. So essentially, what do we look at? We look at there are two potential values over here. Number one, there's Ruvain's expenses, and number two, there's appreciation. Because the assumption always is that dyed wool will always be more valuable than undyed wool. Now granted, he dyed it the wrong color, right? I wanted it black, he dyed it red. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, what do we look at? We look at either, we have two values. Ruvain's expenses, the dyer's expenses, or the appreciation. And Rabbi Yehuda says, I, the owner of the wool, am obligated to pay the lesser of those two amounts. Right? The lesser of appreciation or expenses. Okay, so now let's get into that. Here we go. Rabbi Huda Omer, Ima Shevach. So Yosef Rabbi Yosef Achorid Rabbi Abba Kamed Rav Kuna. Well, let's listen to this. We'll say. So Rabbi Yosef was sitting behind Rabbi Abba in front of Rav Huna. Yosef Rav Huna v'Ka'amar, and Rav Huna was sitting there and he said at his house v'Ka'amar Halacha Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha Halacha Rabbi Huda, and he said the halacha follows Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha and the halacha follows Rabbi Huda. Okay, Ahadrinu Rav Yosef la'apei. So ultimately, again, Rav Yosef turned away. So you have Rav Huna saying the halacha follows Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha and Rabbi Huda, and Rav Yosef turns away. And I will say, now that turning away, that's a shtach, right? That's a shtach, right? So that's turning away in displeasure. In displeasure. So the Gemara says, Amar bishlam Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, it's tirich. So I understand why Rav Huna has to say that the halacha follows Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. Why? Sagadait Chamino, one would have thought, Yochid, now we have no idea what Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha said, right? So we'll have to see. But I would have, maybe there's a need to say it. Why? Because Yochid Rabbi Malachik Rabbim, because also when you have Machlokes in the individual and Rabbim and the group, the halacha follows the Rabbim. Kamash Malon halacha ki Yochid. But in this case over here, the halacha is Rabbi Karcha. Okay. So the Gemara says, by the way, Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha Mahi. Just I don't mean to interrupt over here. Right? What did Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha say? Right? What did he say? Here we go. This is very interesting. The Sanya, Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha Omer. It's fascinating halacha. Malva b'shtar in nefroim mehen, malva al pen nefroim mehen. So what's okay? A little bit of background. Maseches avodah zara. You see Rashi, malva b'shtar in nefroim mehen. Rashi lifnei idehen mipnei shesimcha hilo va'azul model la'akum yom chagam. So also listen to this. This is incredible. There's the Gemara Maseches avodah zara that says, within 3 days of a Gentile Yom Tiv, ultimately, again, you should not collect the debt from a Gentile, right? What's the logic I was saying? Because if I collect the debt from the Gentile, going right before his Yom Tiv, what's going to happen? He's going to go to his house of Avodah Zarah, and what is he going to do? He's going to give Shevach v'hodah to his Avodah Zarah. Why I was saying? Because there is such a good feeling that comes when you repay your debts. It's a good feeling that comes when you repay your debts. And he's going to channel that good feeling ultimately to his Avodah Zarah. And therefore, to a certain degree, you are facilitating heightened connection between an akum and his Avodah Zarah. And I will say, a Yid can't have that level of involvement even within his Avodah Zarah. So therefore, I will say, therefore, the halacha is, milva b'shtar ein nefroim mehen. So Rabbi Shimon Karcha qualifies this halacha. I will say, by the way, it's such a fascinating halacha in general, which ultimately, if you think about it, by the way, what it tells you is, let's say, and we know this just from our own lives, not the Avodah Zarah piece, but the payment of debts piece. When you pay off a debt, and by the way, lav dafka, it's a financial debt. When you come through on something that you are obligated to do, the feeling of accomplishment, right? And the feeling of just often you also feel like 1,000,000 pounds lighter, right? I had an obligation, let's say so many times in life, there are things we have to do, and for whatever the reason, we just kick the can down the road, right? We just don't want to deal with it. And then we realize that not dealing with stuff, right? I don't want to deal with it because it's just so much, it's so difficult. And not dealing with stuff creates more anxiety than dealing with stuff. And then when you deal with it, the feeling of almost sometimes we'll say even a euphoric feeling. Say I had this yesterday. I decided I have to make a list of all the things I have to do. I don't mean on a life level. I just mean stuff that I have to do. And it literally went on to a second page. And I said to her, this is just from Monday, Tuesday. And I said, you know what? I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this. And I said, you know what? No. So that it's hard to avoid, to just avoid and not deal with something. As opposed to say, you know what? Bend your shoulder. It didn't include the Super Bowl, by the way. I just want to point out. Right? I just want to say, so Rahman al-Islam, right? So I'll say, okay, different. I actually was very good. I didn't say anything yesterday. Did I say anything yesterday? Right? Okay, so I'll say, okay, I'm not going to write that. Let's say, so Lamaisa, this idea that when you bend your shoulder and you do the things you have to do and you stop delaying and you stop procrastinating and you actually accomplish, the feeling, almost like the spirit, what do you see? It's almost like a spiritually euphoric feeling you get when you accomplish the things that are upon you in life. And I will say again, we're not even talking about over here lofty spiritual things. We're talking about the stuff you need to do, maybe in your job, the stuff you need to do in your volunteer capacities, the stuff you need to do for your family, the stuff you need to do just the stuff you need to do, the obligations that are upon you. And instead of just ignoring it, you actually do it. It's euphoric. It's euphoric. So the Gemara says, you can't collect your debts from an akum 3 days before his Yom Tov. Why? Because that state of euphoria he's going to channel into his avodah zarah. Incredible. Now Rabbi Shmuel Silber, he qualifies this and he says, when is this true? With the milva b'shtar, with a loan recorded in a document. Why Rabbi said? Because at least if it's recorded in a document, you could collect it any time, right? You have proof of collection. However, milva al pen from mehem veishu kamasel miyadam. However, if it's a verbal loan, then you could collect it whenever you want, right? Whenever you can. Why Rabbi say? What's the concern with a verbal loan? What's the concern? Again, the borrower could deny it. So in other words, Rabbi Shmuel Silber just says, if you have a document, if you have a loan document, okay, so fine, you can collect it anytime. Don't collect it leading up to the Yom Tov. Verbal loan, you better collect it as soon as you can because there's no other proof to it. So therefore, that's why I have to say halachas like Rabbi Shmuel Silber. However, halachas Rabbi Yehuda Lavine. So we'll say, why do you have to say halachas like Rabbi Yehuda? We'll say, after all, now why is it so obvious that halachas like Rabbi Yehuda? Why? Machlokes v'achar kach stamhi, v'machlokes v'achar kach stam halacha kistam. I'll tell you why. It is obvious that halachas like Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because those say, we have a concept like this. Our Mishnah, there's a concept of machlokes. When you have a machlokes, and then ultimately again you have a stam Mishnah afterwards. Stam Mishnah means Mishnah without attribution. So when you have a machlokes, and the machlokes is followed up by a stam, and that stam supports one of the previously aforementioned opinions, then the halacha goes like that aforementioned opinion. So I will say, so apparently, there is our Mishnah, which has a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. And again, what does Rabbi Yehuda say? Rabbi Yehuda says that I give the wool to Ruvain to dye it black. He dyes it red. So I will say, what's the obligation? So now Ruvain gives me back red wool. Did I want red wool? No. So do I have to pay? Do I have to pay Ruvain? Yes. What do I have to pay him? The lesser of expenses or appreciation. That's what I have to pay him. So halachas like Rabbi Yehuda. And I will say, apparently it's obvious that halachas like Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because you have machlokes, our Mishnah, and then a stam Mishnah which supports Rabbi Yehuda. Where's the stam? Machlokes babakama. So our machlokes is here. We'll say in our Mishnah, I gave Reuven the wool to dye red and he dyed it black. Shachut tzava adam, or vice versa. Rabbi Meir Omer no saying samra. Rabbi Meir says, Reuven has to give me back the value of my wool. He's like a thief, essentially. Give me back the value of the object. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ima shevach yesra al yitzia nosen as yitzia, v'ma yitzia yisra al shevach nosen as shevach. Rabbi Yehuda says, no. I, the owner of the wool, get back my wool and pay the lesser of expenses or appreciation. So we'll say, that's our Mishnah. That's our machlokes. That's our Mishnah. Ustam bebab mitzia. And then there's a stam Mishnah above mitzia. What's the stam Mishnah? Disnan kala mishane yado ala tachtona. Ultimately, any of us listen to this. It's incredible. Kala mishane will say, whenever you deviate, ultimately, again, you have the lower hand. So we'll say, what that means is in a transaction, if you deviate from the terms of the transaction, the deviator, yado ala tachtona. Here you're about to say he is at the transactional disadvantage. Similarly, again, we'll say if you renege on a transaction, ultimately, again, you are at the transactional disadvantage. So I will say, so therefore, this Stam Mishnah supports the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Why, Rabbi say? Why? Because Rabbi Yehuda says, I gave the wool to Reuven to dye it black, he dyed it red. So now what's the halacha? Yado ala tachtona. Reuven ultimately again is at a disadvantage. Therefore what? I'm only going to give him the lesser of expenses or appreciation. So therefore you have machlokes in our Mishnah Bava Kama, and then a Stam Mishnah that supports the view of Rabbi Yehuda in Bab Metzia. And I will say ultimately, what's the halacha? Machlokes v'achar kach stam halacha kistam. So therefore, again, I will say, so therefore, coming full circle, why does Rav Huna have to say the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda? It's obvious. It's obvious. First thing was Rav Huna had to say it. Why? Saradai Tchamina ein seder leMishnah ustam bi'achakach machlokesi. So I will say, so this is interesting. So Rav Huna had to say it. Why? Because I will say, you might have thought that maybe there's no order to the Mishnayos, right? And therefore, again, I will say, maybe this is not a case of machlokes the achakach stam, but rather interesting. Maybe it's a case of stam the achakach machlokes. Now I will say, now the principle of machlokes the achakach stam, which means you have machlokes and then you have a stam mishnah without attribution that supports one of the opinions in the machlokes. The halacha follows the supported opinion. That only works if the order is intact. It has to be machlokes v'achakach stam. If it's stam, it's so exciting. If it's stam v'achakach machlokes, then ultimately again that principle doesn't work. So therefore again Rav Huna has to say the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, because you might have thought over here that maybe the order is not machlokes v'achakach stam. Incredible. Rabbi Yosef would say, Rabbi Yosef disagrees with that because he says, then otherwise you can say that about any case of machlokes v'achakach stam, that maybe there's no order in the Mishnah, and therefore the principle never works. Rav Huna, kilo avinan ein seder leMishnah, bechad leMasechta. Rav Huna will say, no. When do we say that there's no order in the Mishnayos? That's only in one Masechta. Aval betrei Masechta saminan. So we'll say, it's actually interesting. So some say that when looking at a particular Masechta, there's no order in the Mishnayos. But from Masechta to Masechta, there's definitely an order in the Mishnayos. Rabbi Yosef will say, Kula Nezikin Chada Masechti. Rabbi Yosef will say all of Nezikin. We'll say all of Seder Nezikin is considered to be one long Masechta. Therefore, again, the concept of Stam v'achakach, or I should say machlokes v'achakach Stam, perhaps ultimately again does not apply. Okay. The other possibility is Mishum Diktani La Gabi Hilchosa Psikta Kol Mashani Yadu Ala Tachtona V'Chol Avozer Bo Yadu Ala Tachtona. But the other possibility is Rav Yosef just did not feel that Rav Huna had to say that halacha was like Rav Yehuda. Why not? Because also we have a principle. The principle is if you change from the transaction, from the agreed upon transactional details, you are put at a disadvantage. I will say that's a principle. That's a principle. Therefore, once you accept that, which everybody does, it is obvious that the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. So I will say, what comes out to be something very interesting, which is, it seems to you, I will say, bottom line is, the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. Namely, if I give my wool to Ruvain, and I tell him dye it black, and it turns out that he dyes it red, what's the halacha? He gives me back the wool, but I will say, what am I obligated for? So remember, we don't pass like Rabbi Meir, right? So Rabbi Meir is off the table, whereas Rabbi Meir's idea that if you change, right, you change the circumstances, so essentially you're like a thief. So because he's like a thief, so Reuven the dyer acquired the wool, and he just obligated to give me back the value of the wool. We don't paskin that way. Instead, the way we paskin is, give me back my wool, and I will say, I have to pay something, because Reuven performed the service. So what do I have to pay him? Like Rabbi Yehuda says, the lesser of Reuven's expenses or appreciation. That's what I pay him. And I will say, now why? Ultimately, again, this is really embedded in the concept that we'll see in Bava Metzia, Kol Mishana Yado Ala Tachtona. If you change the agreed upon details of our transaction, then you, the changer, right, the deviant, doesn't sound right? But you, the deviant, ultimately, again, you, deviator, good, deviator. I know deviant makes it sound so much interesting, right? You, the deviator, ultimately, again, are the one who is put at the halachic disadvantage. Incredible. So we'll say, that's why I said, no, we're not finished yet. We'll say, just also mention, just even al pidar chashkafa, that phrase, kol hamishana yado ala tachtona. Little the one who changes the details, right? The deviator ultimately is put at a disadvantage. We'll say, I think there's also a profound yisod in this. And we'll say, a lot of times in life, we want to affect changes, right? Internal, external changes, right? And in our lives. And sometimes we think that when you make the right changes, right? Changes that are good for my personal kedusha, for the kedusha of my lifestyle, we kind of often operate with the assumption that if you do the right things in life, everything should fall into place immediately. right? And if I'm Moser Nefesh to make the changes in my life, then everything should just be fantastic. And I will say a lot of times in life it doesn't work that way. In the long game, that is absolutely unequivocally true. What it's important to know is that sometimes in life, when we make changes, real good changes, sometimes it's kol mishana yodo ala tachtona. Sometimes the immediate repercussion of making change in life is difficulty and setback. Even though, again, I'm doing this for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'm doing this to advance my own Kedusha, I'm doing this for all the right reasons. But sometimes, and I will say, that's part of the Mesiras Nefesh. If making change was easy, and if making change in life came with immediate benefit, right, and immediate bracha, then what? We'd all do it. The reason why change is so powerful and so impactful is often because it comes with initial setback, and it comes with initial adversity, and it comes with initial difficulty. And I have to make the change knowing that and believing with my full heart that if I make these changes in my life, at the end of the day, I will get myself to I know where I need to be. And that's what Chazal is saying. It's not just Shuna Allah, Shuna Ashkafa. Kalamashane Yado ala Tachtona. When you make changes in life, be ready to suffer a little bit of setback. And be ready to have moments of turbulence. And don't be afraid of it. So I'll say, so many times in life we don't make the changes we need to make. Why? Because I'm afraid of the turbulence. I'm afraid of the difficulty. I don't want to have to deal with like rocking the boat. So what do? We just maintain a system of sustained mediocrity because I just want to kind of keep things solid. Because I don't want the turbulence that is associated with change. But while it's true that if you make change in life, it comes with a little bit of turbulence, or sometimes a lot of turbulence and some initial difficulty, just know that if you stay with it, it opens the door to dramatic bracha. All right, so let's go weiter. These are such great cases. We need like 3 hours each daf. Who's up for that? Oh yeah, I'm not gonna take a vote. Hey, Tana Avanan. Hanosin Ma'os l'shluchos. Once you watch this case, I give money to my shaliach. So I'm giving money to Reuven. Call Reuven is my shaliach. We'll say Amud Beis. Likach lo chitin, v'lakach man sorin. I tell Reuven to go buy wheat, and he buys barley. Sorin v'lakach man chitin, or I send him to buy barley, and he goes and buys wheat. Now, both say that this is a different kind of case. Look at Rashi. Rashi's Amud Beis Likach by Chidin lemachzis schar. I will say in this case over here, why am I telling Reuven to buy wheat? I will say this is a business transaction. I'm not eating anything over here, right? I'm asking to buy commodities. We're gonna go into business. This is a business deal, right? So I'm telling Reuven, listen, buy wheat, right? Buy it at $10 a bushel, and sweets, I don't know if it's a bushel, right? A bushel, and we're going to sell it, for 15, somewhere else. That's the, and again, Reuven, this is going to be a profit sharing agreement. That's what's happening over here. So Reuven, go buy the wheat, and it turns out that Reuven buys barley, or vice versa. So we'll say, now what's the halacha in a case like this? So what's interesting about this is, the shlichus was made under a certain type of agreement. Reuven deviated from the terms of the shlichus. So Tani Chad, one brayso says, in pachsulo, the mosiro is zero. So we'll say one opinion says, listen, essentially, whatever gains or benefits belong to Reuven solely. Now, as we'll say, the first price seems to say like this: since Reuven broke with the terms of the agreement, essentially what? We don't have an agreement. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, essentially, Reuven acquired the item on his own, and halacha l'maisa, whatever happens, right? Appreciation, depreciation, he's got to deal with it on his own. Okay. But Tanichad, the other opinion says, in pichsulo, other opinion says, no, if it's depreciated, Reuven deals with all the depreciation. Interesting, but if there's appreciation is shared. Okay, so I'll say very interesting. So what is this? So Rabbi Yochanan lo kasha. Rabbi Yochanan says it's not a contradiction. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda. We'll say it's our Mishnah. So we'll say the first price that says whether it appreciated or depreciated, it all belongs to Reuven. We'll say who's opinion is that? That's Rabbi Meir. What does Rabbi Meir hold? What does Rabbi Meir hold? Rabbi Meir holds that if you're entrusted to do something and you deviate, then what's the halakha? Essentially, you're like a ganef. you're like a ganef. Now again, I will say, I want to be clear. We're not calling the guy a ganef, but essentially you're treated like a ganef. The same way a ganef steals something, he acquires the object, is obligated to go ahead and pay back the owner the value of the item at the time that it was stolen. So too, if I hire Reuven to buy wheat, and instead he goes ahead and he buys barley, okay, so you went rogue, essentially, quote unquote, stole the item, you're obligated to give me back my money, right? But Lamaisa, any appreciation or depreciation of the item, Reuven, it's yours. In other words, the item essentially becomes his. He is just obligated to give me back the money I gave him. Whereas the second opinion of Bose is Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold Shinui Kona. And therefore Rabbi Yehuda will say, look, now Bose, how you fit this? And now we're going to say it's Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda will say, therefore, depreciation, Reuven, you got to bear that on your own. Appreciation, we're going to split that in the middle. So the Gemara says, Lo kashar Meir Har Yehuda. Har Meir damar Shinui Kona. V'har Rabbi Yehuda da amar Shinui Eina Kona. So we just said before. So Maskef Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Lazar says, I don't know if that's true. Mimai. Dilma Atkan Kamar Meir Ela B'midi D'Chazil Gufei. First of all, like this, comes along Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi says, whoa. Right? Rabbi Meir's Shita so far has been espoused only in what kind of case I will say? In an object that I am using for my own personal benefit. However, Aval Schora Lo Amar. How do you know about say, maybe Rabbi Meir treats business transactions differently. Right? I will say, remember, where have we seen the Shita of Rabbi Meir so far? We've seen Rabbi Meir in cases like, I'm giving you wool to dye, right? This is my wool, I'm going to use my wool. We'll say, maybe this case is different. This is a business transaction. We'll say, what is the goal? What is the goal ultimately, again, of a business transaction? What's the goal? I will say, this in general is an interesting, I'm not a businessman, obviously, but this is interesting that, workplaces have suddenly become like the hubs of diversity and equality and the this and the that. I would say people forgot, the point of a business is to make money, right? And that's all it's about, making money. Yeah, you should take care of the people who help you make money. Don't get involved in politics. Don't get involved in causes. Don't get involved in anything else, right? It's good old capitalism. Make money and make a lot of it. That's the goal. So I will say, this is incredible. So the Gemara suggests over here, I will say, where does it come from? It comes from Rabbi Meir. The Gemara says something interesting, that maybe Rabbi Meir only holds this idea in a case of where you have an object for your own use. But in a business transaction, where the goal is to make money, maybe Rabbi Meir doesn't care all that much if Reuven differs from my instructions, as long as what? As long as we're making money, right? We are good to go. We're good to go. So in other words, the Gemara says, don't automatically apply the shade of Rabbi Meir. Ella, Rabbi Lazar, Ha Rabbi Meir. Ooh, very interesting. Meir will say both opinions of Rabbi Meir, and what? Lokashya, kan la'achi lekan l'schora. Fascinating. Maybe the two brises ultimately again Rabbi Meir. First brisa that says ultimately again that Reuven keeps the barley. I told him to get wheat. He bought barley. He keeps the barley, and the appreciation and depreciation is his. That's when I contracted him to buy me food. So instead of my own personal benefit, that's what Rabbi Meir says. Ultimately, if you deviated, you keep the item. Give me back the original money I gave to you. The second brisa that says that Reuven has to bear the depreciation, but we share in the appreciation. That's where it's a business transaction. Rabbi Yochanan, so the Gemara says, Machku alev ma'arava. Wow. So when they said this over in Eretz Yisrael, they laughed about it. Machku alev ma'arava. The Rabbi Yochanan libid Rabbi Yehuda, in Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of Rabbi Yehuda, V'chi mi hodil lebal chitin, sheyikne chitin lebal mos. So the Gemara says like this. We'll say, so remember, in Rabbi Yochanan's model was like this. Rabbi Yochanan's model was that Rabbi Yochanan just that brisa number 1, which said essentially that Reuven keeps all of them, right? Reuven keeps the item and Reuven refunds the money and he keeps appreciation and depreciation. That was Rabbi Meir. Second brisa that says that Reuven keeps the depreciation, but they split the appreciation. So they laughed at that. So the Gemara says, why? Who told the owner of the wheat that he should go ahead and that he can or that he should convey part of the ownership to the owner of the money? Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Quick look. Rashi, this is the second short line. Lamocher achitin shelatzorach balamos hein shiyikna lo diktani osilem. So I will say, okay, so let's talk about this just a second. Watch this. Rabbi Yochanan's version out like this. I give Ruvain $1,000. Say, Ruvain, go and buy barley. He buys wheat. Now I will say, now what's the halacha? The halacha is if it appreciates, what happens? We share the appreciation. Now both sides, but yet if it depreciates, ultimately Ruvain shares all the depreciation. Shabbos says, now what the Gemara is essentially asking is, why does Ruvain have to share depreciation after all? After all what? After all, Ruvain is the one who bought the wheat, right? He bought the wheat. So Lamaisa now, when the person sold the wheat, he sold the wheat to Ruvain, right? He sold the wheat to Ruvain. If he sold the wheat to Ruvain, then why do I get any share in the appreciation at all? Right? Ruvain should really have all of the appreciation himself. Right? At the end of the day, in other words, Lamaisa, what I was also asking over here is, in other words, obviously, if you're making him bear all of the depreciation, that means he has some level of almost like exclusive ownership over that object. So then why doesn't his exclusive ownership ultimately devolve upon the appreciation as well? Let him keep the entire appreciation. Who, in other words, we'll say, the only way that would work is if the owner of the wheat had in mind to convey to me some chelik of this. So I'm asking for Rav Shalom bar sas parati. Ihaki, if that's the case, afilu chitin dechitin amilo. Rabbi, you can ask that in any case. In any case where let's say I give Ruvain money to go buy wheat. And what? I will say, he buys wheat. He's the guy who contracted with the wheat salesman. If so, essentially he's the buyer. If he's the buyer, then maybe he should get to keep all appreciation in general. In other words, we'll say, what halachically compels him to share that appreciation with me, the owner of the money? So the Gemara says, Am Rabbi Yavo, shiny chitin the shlichus ka'avid. The chika balabaisa. And I will say it's different. When I contract Ruvain to buy wheat and he buys wheat, I will say, what is that? That's shlichus. I will say, what shlichus? What's the principle of shlichus? Shlucho shal adam kimoso. Your shaliach is an extension of you. Teida, we'll say, I'll show you this is true. Teida is an interesting case. Echad hamakdish nechasa ve'echad hamarachis hatzros. Listen to this. If you decide to consecrate your property, right? Or you decide ultimately again to make an erech vow. Erech vow means you pledge your value to the Beis HaMikdash. Ein lo biksus ishto v'lo biksus banav v'lo b'tzeva shetzavan l'shma. Shabbos say, listen to this. What's not included in your vow? What's not included in your vow? Your wife's clothing, your children's clothing, any clothing that you dyed ultimately again for them. V'lo b'sandalim chadashim shalach l'shma, or not for any new shoes or any new items that you bought from them. I was supposed to say, if you're makdish your stuff, that stuff is all right. That hektish or that era is only on your stuff. It does not devolve upon your wife's and children's stuff. V'amai, why not? So I don't understand. Let's say I bought my wife a dyed article of clothing. So I will say, I bought it from the seller. So ultimately, again, if I'm makdish my property, why doesn't that dyed item become hektish as well? After all, who told the seller to be maknit to my wife? It belongs to me. I will say, even talking about a case where I didn't give it to my wife yet, right? It belongs to me. So if it belongs to me, why doesn't hektish devolve upon that as well? So I will say, so ultimately, why is it? Because when I buy something for my wife, essentially, what am I doing? I'm acting essentially as her shaliach, and therefore, again, as her shaliach, therefore the object becomes hers from the time of the purchase, and therefore never really enters into my ownership. So to Rabbi say, the halacha seems to be that when I send the shaliach to go ahead and do something, and he complies with my wishes, he is my extension, and therefore halacha l'maisa, the object becomes mine from the beginning. Masha'inkin, if he doesn't comply with my wishes, that's when things begin to get a little bit rocky. So stop over for today. We're going to pick up. I'm kind of leaving you off in the middle of the sugya. We'll pick up with it tomorrow. Tremendous stuff. Shkoyach. Yeah. Yes. Maybe I'm going to meet you over there. Okay.